Alright. If the mythology of the Border Patrol revealed around the renditions of the past that romanticized the vanishing Indians, it was also driven by myopic visions of the nation's racial and demographic future. Like the eugenist Goethe, who told the morality tale about the mating of the U.S. couple that ended disastrously because of their typhus-ridden Mexican maid, patrolmen and their superiors were charged with protecting the quote American family and nations from potential contamination from alien outsiders. As one military expert said when presenting his plan for an enlarged border patrol to Congress um, as one military expert said when presenting his plan for an enlarged border patrol to Congress in 1926, quote, undesirable aliens often on the riverbank may tell the plain story of the landing of a smuggler's boat, end quote. By developing an instinctual connection to the southwestern topography, its flora and fauna, inhabitants, and weather patterns, patrolmen revived and protected. Wait a second. Oh, did I just read that again? I thought I just switched the page. Sorry about that. Undesirables often became public charges and must be cared for by our pauper institutions and insane asylums. Many are further menace to the health of the communities in which they settle. End quote. For many patrolmen, this meant embracing the heroic image of the Lone Ranger who risked his life against all odds to save others. Many recruiters were attracted to the Border Patrol because they viewed it as another incarnation of the rough and tumble Texas Rangers or the Rough Riders that Teddy Roosevelt had led up Cuba's San Juan Hill during the Spanish-American War. In this sense, if the USPHS and Pierce in particular can be interpreted as bringing colonial medicine from island and isthmus to the U.S.-Mexican border, then many of the Border Patrol's first members should be seen as embodying a cowboy's and Indian's primitive masculinity born out of the imperial conflict and conquest in the U.S. West. The so-called grandfather of the Border Patrol, Jefferson Davis Milton, one of the original Texas Rangers, epitomized this macho persona. After chasing Apaches, Milton resigned from the Rangers in 1880s to work as a deputy sheriff, a customs inspector, El Paso chief of police, and a Wells Fargo messenger. In 1904, he joined the Immigration Bureau, was presented with a badge, and soon became known in lore as the, quote, one-man border patrolman, end quote, personifying gritty ruggedness, and bravado. Milton, quote, was known throughout the great Southwest for his many feats of uh, daring do, and was recognized by his admirers as a, quote, real hombre. Bombre? I'm pretty sure that's an H, right? A real hombre? Okay. While this legacy attracted a mix of cowpunchers, ranch hands, war veterans, and civil servants to the Border Patrol, it also troubled many of the agency's officers, especially who's concerned with presenting an image of sober professionalism. As soon as the patrol was established, both immigration officers in the field and their superiors in Washington embarked on a campaign to shift the authority of surveillance from the local to the federal level. Clifford Perkins, who helped to design the organizational scheme of the Border Patrol and wrote a memoir about his career, directed attempts to temper the unruliness of many patrolmen, responding in part to the denunciations that trigger-happy patrolmen were arbitrarily arresting Mexican American citizens and outlawful and unlawfully entering homes. Perkins traveled from El Paso headquarters in the late 1920s to take stock of the Laredo and San Antonio branches. In these districts, a large percentage of patrolmen were ex-Rangers. Perkins explained that the professionalization of such men was a trying and sometimes unsuccessful endeavor. Quote, it took uh, considerable indoctrinating to convince some of the inspectors they were not chasing outlaws, and we never did get out of the heads of and we never did get it out of the heads of all of them, for we had to discharge several for being too rough, end quote. Nevertheless, Perkins asserted that through repeated inculcation for the need of hierarchy, self-discipline, and adherence to the agency's motto, quote, honor first, he was eventually able to turn coarse frontiersmen into well-mannered soldiers. From a Border Patrol's inception, this makeover was linked to practicing marksmanship and daily calisthenics. In 1934, when the Border Patrol Academy was established in El Paso, more involved screening and preparations of recruit was put in place. Perkins boasted that it required just 2 years of his leadership in El Paso for this district patrol to become a, quote, healthy, coordinated outfit that inspired a considerable amount of public confidence, end quote. He claimed that close to a decade after its formation, quote, the officers were well trained and disciplined. They could be counted on to any tight spot they encountered. Generally, they reflected the efforts expanded to set up a model of a nationwide responsible division of the immigration service we hoped the patrol would become. This trend toward professionalization meant that by the 1930s, the exaltation of the patrolman as cowboy ranger was being overshadowed by the veneration of tamer type of male hero, the compassionate yet brawny protector. This reorientation fit was well. Uh, this reorientation fit well with eugenic concerns about the need to embrace immigration laws in order to guarantee the proper boundaries of the nation and the inactness of the white American family. Intactness, sorry. Converging with the nascent discourse of the welfare state, which stigmatized dependency and valorized propagation only of the fit, immigration officials and patrolmen began to cast their activities of seizure, arrest, and deportation in paternalistic terms. It is striking that INS Deputy Commissioner I.F. Wixon chose to conclude his 1934 Intransitive Act tract, quote, the mission of the Border Patrol, by proclaiming compassion for the honest, industrious alien whose only offense has been illegal entry in the United States, end quote. Despite this benevolent gesture, however, Wixon went on to claim that although such an alien might seem quite innocent, his intention into the country would necessarily lead to disruption and familial disintegration. Oof. Speaking hypothetically, Wixon proposed the following scenario, quote, in the natural course of events, he marries an American citizen, establishes a home, becomes the father of an American-born children. Then comes his arrest on deportation charges. End quote. Once excluded, this alien would be forced to abandon his wife and children, who in turn would have no choice but to turn to the largesse of the federal government. In this vision, human sympathy and defense of the nation's border were one of the same. It was imperative to debar such interlopers before, quote, they had sunk their roots into this country and given hostages to fortune in the shape of American-born wives and children who would be the main sufferers in the almost inevitable event of their ultimate defection and deportation. Um, okay, yeah, the only thing they'd be losing out on is a fucking father that loved their family. But yeah, I can see this fucking nonsense that they're spouting is just an attachment to think of the children. But, anyways, by the 1930s, the logic of paternal surveillance at play during the Laredo branding incident had developed into one of the core operating principles of the Border Patrol. The degree to which familial metaphors were mobilized to express the links between patriotism, gender, and race is illustrated by the writings of Anglo border women who corresponded with Border Patrol. For example, the sister of the patrolman who had been killed in a smuggling shootout during the Rio Grande penned the agency a letter in 1929, referring to the Border Patrol as the boys. She she thanked her brother's compatriots for their fraternalism and told them that she could be found praying every night for the quote God-fearing men who for the sake of civilization, leave your happy homes and loved ones at night, rain or shine, and go home to the river, to that terrible river, trying to uphold and enforce the laws of our country. End quote. Asking God to watch over all the patrolmen, she implored the boys to think of the fathers and mothers, wives and babies in homes. End quote. And to act carefully. Similar analogies between patriarchy at home and manliness on the line were echoed by Mary Kidder Rack, um, the wife of an Arizona rancher, in her two popular books on the Border Patrol. By the decade of the Great Depression, the racial division that was emerging in 1900 had hardened an uneven but pervasive vision of Jim Crow segregation in the U.S.-Mexican borderlands. In many parts of the Southwest and California, this process of social differentiation involved many more than just a binary division. It revolved around shifting exclusionary dynamics and hierarchies among whites, African Americans, Mexicans, and Chinese, who faced harsh xenophobia on both sides of the U.S.-Mexican border. Increasingly, it also involved pronounced animosity between middle class and professional Mexican Americans and more recent working class arrivals from Mexico. From the 1910s to the 1940s, the USPHS and Border Patrol promoted and shaped the multi-layered process of racialization in the U.S.-Mexican borderlands by making admissibility into the United States dependent on standards of health and cleanliness, or the illusion of that, obviously. The USPHS emerged medicalization with the process of social and racial labeling. This pattern was clearly underway in incipient form in 1916 when Laredo's Mexicans discovered that passage across a previously open space had become contingent upon a physical examination at the ink stamping of their arm. When the typhus quarantine was inaugurated the following year, medicalization along the border became systematic and streamlined. For more than 2 decades, the quarantine and its accompanying procedures of disinfection and vaccination uh, discursively linked Mexicans with disease and pathology. Nativists and eugenicists repeatedly mobilized the stereotypes that spiraled out of the border context in the 1920s and 1930s in an effort to curtail immigration from the South. Furthermore, the quarantine also left its mark as the external borders of nation became intimate frontiers for Mexican border crossers, whose memoirs of indirectional or circular migration came to include humiliation as their naked bodies were showered with chemicals, their hair was sheared, and their baggage was fumigated and often ruined. So yeah, basically their livelihoods are just tormented. And I bet you it's hard to show proof of your existence when all your shit is destroyed. And that's a reason for you to get sent back to Mexico, I guess, because the safety protocols made it harder to determine who you are. I bet that's just what they use uh, to ruin these people's lives on purpose. All right. Vivid medicalized associations insinuated themselves into campaigns to enact immigration quotas for Southern Hemisphere and into proclamations about the Mexican menace. For example, reformers intent on controlling vice on the U.S. side by policing prostitution and upholding prohibition regularly availed themselves of adjectives such as dirty, lousy, and infected to describe Mexican border towns and their inhabitants. In the 1920s, U.S. calls for border closings, which typically followed drunken and violent incidents involving Americans who sought the illicit uh, across the national line. Um, reveled in the language, a trend that Mexicans noted with displeasure. The, the implementation of closures uh, among along the string of ports of entry on the California-Mexican border led to stinging rebukes from chambers of commerce on the Mexican side. In 1929, the Tijuana Chamber expressed dismay about the justifications frequently used for such actions, waiting to President Herbert Hoover that we, quote, do not consider ourselves an inferior race whose contact means danger at night hours, nor as a body inflicted with infectious plague, end quote. If the quarantine concentrated on the boundary line when the monitoring of the Border Patrol extended the border into the U.S. interior, preceded by the Spanish mili- militarists who guarded the presidios, the Texas Rangers who hounded the Comanches and Apaches, and the first immigration line riders stationed on the border in early 1900s. The Border Patrol emerged out of both local and national concerns. On one hand, it was a response to the growing numbers of immigrants who started circumventing designated ports of entry, in part to avoid the quarantine. On the other, the Border Patrol must be situated within the debates over immigration restriction that gripped the United States in the 1920s and resulted in the passage of the Johnson-Reed Act in 1924. From multiple angles, and Border Patrol can be understood as a facet of the larger eugenic movement rooted in anxiety about biological purity and attendant to contracting and shifting attitudes or categories of race. Perhaps somewhat unexpectedly, it is not the Border Patrol's initial incarnation as a uniformed extension of the Texas Ranger, but its more professionalized image as a federal police agency that illuminates some of its most striking affinities with eugenic ideas about racial purity and protection of America. Indeed, some patrolmen, even as they enacted the racist scripts that helped turn Mexicans into illegal aliens, also linked to cast themselves as empathetic protectors who disliked and decried the mistreatment of women and the separation of families. What the fuck? This is twisted. Holy shit. You're gonna play optics about how much you care and then behind the scenes actually literally do the opposite. I mean, typical, obviously. Alright. The Border Patrol embraced the image of the benevolent patriarch who guarded the body politic. This more restrained and upstanding masculinity was part of the gendered persona of the patrolman that cohort in 1930s and 1940s that sought to maintain boundaries that were once national, biological, and social. In this sense, the Border Patrol influenced the country's demographic composition and shaped understandings of the legitimate American family during a moment when the welfare state was expanding and the category of whiteness was coming to include previously designated ethnic whites and to exclude Mexicans and Asians. Moreover, the eugenic impulse behind the formation of the Border Patrol, which harbored particular enmity toward Mexicans and far-reaching impact beyond the border region and affected health and welfare agencies and healthcare access throughout the American West. Working in tandem, medicalization and militarization helped congeal fulmuric, uh, formulaic association of Mexicans as illegal, alien, and disease that continue to have profound reverberations for Mexican and Chicana slash O communities, as well as for contemporary immigration and border control debates. All right. So I basically just read this chapter as the background lore of what is still being continued to this day, uh, in the name of safety standards, even though there isn't really any danger to be had. All right. Kind of glad I